63% of males in the United States are single, in comparison to 34% of their female counterparts. Men only have a 2.5% chance of finding a match. That's one match per 40 swipes on average on online dating apps, whereas women match 50% of the time, one match per 2 swipes on average. But the dismissal of men doesn't stop there. 90% of jobs requiring hard manual labor are held by men. Men make up around 84% of active duty military personnel in the United States. But that doesn't specify combat arms roles. You know, the ones who actually risk their lives. Over 95% of combat arms roles are filled by men. And in special ops, well, women are nowhere to be found. And to dig the knife even further, 79% of suicides in the United States are committed by men. Despite their efforts to provide and protect women and children, they're left hung out to dry when 70% of divorces are initiated by women. In part 1 of Why Are 63% of Men Single?, I got over 1,500 comments from angry, hurting, and wounded men who are fed up with these statistics and many others that I just laid out for you. But before I get into this video, I do want to provide a disclaimer. If you can't watch this video with an open mind, then this will likely be a waste of your time. So if that's you, click off now. But if you choose to watch this video, you'll start to understand the other side of this coin, which is how women are contributing to this epidemic, and more importantly, how it's harming them more than they realize. As always, leave your intelligent comments below. Sprinkle, sprinkle, bitch. Let's get into it. And this brings me to my first point. Social media. The ability to garner mass attention through social media is not news. Yet women seem to be able to do this at a much larger scale, and these results boost their ego as they continue to gain this attention and traction. But the attention they get, especially from men, aren't necessarily men that they'd ever give the time of day to. Yet they continue to do it and promote further engagement. Why? When we look at behaviors on social media, we do see differences between men and women, how they post and how they interact. And women on average spend much more time on social media, and their focus is typically on connections and communication. Men, on the other hand, tend to, yes, use social media platforms for their own entertainment, but mostly, as far as the research shows, for information. And the research also shows that women tend to gain both a larger following and further engagement than men typically do, specifically on visual platforms like Instagram and TikTok. And this makes sense if you took 5 seconds to scroll any of these social media platforms. And because they tend to garner bigger audiences relative to beauty, lifestyle, fitness, etc., it also tends to amplify their voices and their messages, which I'll get to in a little bit. And while we can talk about the niches and the topics of conversation, I also don't want to skimp over the fact that there's typically lots of skin showing, and this tends to garner further traction and growth, which only re-emphasizes the point that in order for women to get noticed, well, their beauty and their physical assets are the most important thing. On top of this, research does show that women tend to garner a bigger following through sharing stories and emotional connection. And we also know from a psychological lens that women tend to gossip much more than men do. And social media tends to promote, well, drama. So the maths here. Now, I don't want to paint this picture that men can't be successful on social media platforms because the evidence would also be contrary to that. But as far as in comparison to, women do tend to outperform men, again, specifically on these visual platforms. So why am I hitting on this? Well, relative to my last video with 1,500 plus comments around the toxicity of women, social media and the amplification of their voice and also how they garner audiences plays a role in this dynamic playing itself out. With a discrepancy in followers and engagement, this can fuel toxic feminism or feminist ideals, and this can contribute over time to further animosity towards men. Now, the interesting thing about social media and its parts is that women tend to gain traction by being visually appealing, only to then be upset when men pay attention to how physically appealing they are. But the reinforcement of positive feedback around gaining followers, engagement, comments, whatever it might be, only reinforces women to continue to behave in this way publicly. And this can inadvertently promote the idea that a woman's value lies in her aesthetics or her social appeal. And this can reinforce the narrative, as we've seen many times, that women are all, well, promiscuous, while men can be excluded or marginalized in these spaces. The hard part about this, or the female argument to this type of behavior, is that it is somehow empowering, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. While from a man's perspective, while they enjoy women being a little bit more loose online, they also tend to associate that with a lower quality female. Now, what's important to note around this entire concept in attraction, relationships, whatever it is, women tend to set the standard for sexual intimacy. which is a really important point, and I will get to that later in this video. Now, toxic feminism can and has emerged when women perceive their higher success on these platforms as a form of empowerment that positions men as less relevant or inherently problematic. And this feeds into the negative stereotype of men's role in society. Pair that with the feedback loop of monetary payouts, and you can reinforce this behavior even at the expense of one's self-respect and self-worth. It's also important to note, as I alluded to earlier, that social media platforms tend to reward polarizing content, and this can lead to the amplification of much more radical concepts and extremist feminist voices, which tends to portray men as inherently oppressive or completely responsible for any type of systemic inequality. And while these perspectives tend to gain significant engagement, it can also encourage the narrative of complete victimhood when it comes to women, leading to further antagonism towards men. And this will continue to lead to further hostility and division between the genders, as we can see if you've read my comment section. And because men tend to experience lower engagement on social media, due to the fact that they simply engage with and tend to create different types of content, whether that be that they're less driven or focused on their own perception of aesthetics or looks, or just less emotionally charged than women are, which is true, it may not perform as well and therefore not garner such a radical audience. And this can lead to a perception that men are completely disengaged or irrelevant, which can then further lead into amplifying feminist narratives that men are not important or not engaged or don't care. And this will continue to lead narratives that degrade men and, well, push them to be resentful of women and their overall behavior. And this can compound feelings of inadequacy towards men, especially if they feel like their voices aren't valued. And this again leads to further polarizing domains between the genders. Now, as women continue to gain success and traction, while there's a side effect of communities that they engage with as well. As I touched on MGTOW and Red Pill in the last video, I do want to make sure that I address the fact that there are female communities which tend to lead to misandry towards men. And this can oversimplify the gender dynamic and create us versus them mentalities. Now, what happens when men speak up, especially relative to the differences between men and women in their success or engagement on social media platforms, is that men are then contributing to a problem, or they feel intimidated by women when they're just acknowledging a difference in success. And one thing we know about social media and building audiences is that oftentimes you can kind of sound an alarm that may or may not be real. And I don't just mean this in social media, but I don't want to get into actual CNN, Fox News, and all the other platforms that shove shit down your throat that may not actually be based in reality. But to this degree, the more that there's no barrier to entry and anybody can come online and say anything, well, we can start to create narratives that have some truth, but take it to the extreme. And this is where women tend to hyperfixate on gender inequalities, the pay gaps, oppression, the patriarchy, you name it, it's been said many, many times. And this can then turn into a blame game where women blame all men for every problem and treat them as if they're responsible. And this leads to rhetoric that completely demonizes men, rather than addressing the actual causes of some of these things, specifically when we look at them oriented towards equal outcome. And when followers engage with and promote this type of content, it normalizes misandry, escalating the tension between the genders, and completely removes the underlying reasons as to why some of these outcomes are things that we witness, which, again, I'll get to in a little bit. But overall, this puts a lot of pressure on men to conform to be a certain way, changing their standards, submitting to women, or making their masculinity toxic or outdated. And this can lead to reactions such as retreating to male-dominated spaces, as I mentioned in my last video. And this is where, especially if life circumstances led men to engage with women who were very toxic, that their perception can be a bit jaded towards, well, what does a modern woman want, and is she even worth it? And this is just the first point. We're gonna be here a while, so grab a drink, get comfortable. We've got a lot to talk about. And this brings me to my next point, dating apps. As I alluded to earlier, 75% of users, specifically in research oriented towards Tinder, are men. But the amount of swiping that men have to go through, and reflective of the algorithm and what it tends to promote, a lot of men, well, they get overlooked. Whereas women, on the other hand, have a 50% chance of finding success in a match, meaning I could swipe twice and find somebody that would match with me. Whereas a man might have to swipe 40 times and maybe will get one match. And this allows women to be much more selective, while men tend to experience further rejection. And this will lead to further feelings of inadequacy, neglect, and frustration. For many men, especially those that are not deemed conventionally attractive, this entire experience can feel like an uphill battle. And because dating apps emphasize visual attraction, and men often face rejection solely based on their appearance, men who may excel in other areas or have just better overall character traits or qualities tend to get overlooked in favor of more visually appealing profiles, which leads to a sense of devaluation or pressure to conform to a certain standard of high value man. And we also have to note that algorithms on each of these dating apps varies a bit differently, and those who tend to receive more engagement also tend to get promoted a little bit more often. And this disproportionately benefits the more attractive people, while leaving the majority of men struggling for visibility. On top of all of this, any type of dating online values aesthetics over all of the things that actually make a relationship work. And this leads to shallow and surface level interactions between the genders and themselves. Men being more valued for their status and women being more valued for their sexual appeal. And this will foster a sense of transactional relationships and reduce the opportunity to build actually deep and meaningful connections. In my last video, I talked about the negative impacts of rejection on men's mental health, so I won't dive back into that here, but just know men's sense of rejection and the way that it impacts their self-esteem is really important, highly valuable, and a consequence to how all of this social and cultural pressure in the domain of feminism and social media, dating apps, all contributes to the experiences that men are having, and the reason why many of them are self-selecting and choosing to stay single. Where social media and dating apps can completely polarize gender dynamics, with a very small percentage of high-status men getting a lot of attention, while many men feel completely visible. Now, one important thing to note here is the paradox of choice, and both men and women can experience this phenomenon. But this is where having too many options can lead to complete dissatisfaction. Women who tend to have way more matches also tend to struggle with making a commitment to one person, because there's always someone or something better lurking right around the corner. And men on the other side of the coin might feel completely disheartened by a lack of options or being repeatedly passed over. Now, I did allude to earlier that women tend to set the standard for men regarding sex. And the cultural shift towards dating apps and service level hookups makes casual sex more accessible and prevalent to both genders. For men, this tends to amplify short-term dating approaches over long-term commitments. And women tend to lie to themselves, telling themselves that they're just like men and can do this in the same fashion. However, the easier it is to access, the lower the level of effort that men will give. And so even if women are genuinely seeking deeper connections, they also should align their standards and expectations for men that they allow themselves to engage with to be much higher than they currently are. Which brings me to my next point, and it's a very important one. The concept of hypergamy. The number of comments in my last video discussing hypergamy leads me to believe that more than a 10-second clip in this video is going to do this concept justice. So first, let's look at and understand what this actually means. Hypergamy is the idea that women tend to marry up. As far as gender dynamics, women date up and across, and men date across and down. This could be relevant to status, IQ, material items, but perceived differences between the sexes. Simply put, we're always looking for something better. And this is a complex subject, and it is also rooted in evolutionary psychology, which is one of my favorite domains of psychology to investigate. But some would argue that this is a cultural, societal norm, while others say it's just gender dynamics. And the mere mention of this term can trigger people or spark debates. While some see this as a natural biological instinct, others argue that it's a social construct that's been molded by culture and upbringing. So what's the truth here? Traditionally, this concept makes a lot of sense, where women needed financial security and a provider in order to make sure that they were safe and secure. But because nowadays, with the cultural changes in women's rights movements, women are able to cultivate their own levels of perceived independence, which shifts this dynamic on its head. And many men, as a contrast to that, currently feel like hypergamy creates a lot of unrealistic expectations and standards for men. Many men have reported that despite their own accomplishments, it's just never enough. And for women, as far as their ability to create their own wealth or achieve their own education and success, autonomy and independence, the idea of a relationship and what it used to bring them has somewhat changed. And this disconnect, transparently, I believe, is leading it to a massive disconnect on both sides. And if I were to bring data into this conversation, it shows that educated and financially successful women are struggling to find men, which complicates the modern dating world for both genders. It's also important to note that whether this is a biological driver or something that is culturally imposed, either way it leads to dissatisfaction. One of the most important points that I can allude to here, and yes, I do want to be transparent, this is my own personal opinion, women don't know what they need. They just perceive what they want, what they're supposed to do, who they're supposed to be with, the type of guy that would make them valuable enough or worthy enough to feel good about who they are and what their worth or value really comes down to. This is also one of the contrasts where women tend to tell themselves that they can be just like men. Now, this does not mean that women who really do enjoy sexual interactions with men are wrong, but I do not believe that the majority of women actually enjoy engaging in that at a surface level, transactionary level. Many men in my comment section will say that they just want virgins, and if you're that guy, I will say it might be difficult for you to find somebody that's above the age of 18. But that does not mean that there is not value that women should have around their bodies, around sexual intercourse, around giving themselves to somebody else. It's all about what works best for you, and I know that brings a lot of context and nuance, but I really don't like to be degrading towards either side. Do I personally align with those types of values? No. However, we can see with the fall of faith, religion, Christianity, that, well, we've moved into this sexual revolution and this empowerment of women through showing off their bodies and feeling empowered by the objectification of that, especially when we pair that in tandem with, well, their ability to make money through things like OnlyFans or pornography. In my last video, I alluded to a lot of things around pornography and men's interaction with that, but I do want to be transparent in the fact that, well, men could not watch women having sex with other men if women chose not to film themselves doing such an activity. I do not think it is one side or the other, which a lot of men, and you may disagree with me completely on, and that's okay. But to point the finger at one gender and say you are the reason for this problem, like me personally, I believe that there is a level of accountability on both sides. And the other side of this coin, which I'll get to in a minute as far as the feminist movement and empowerment, but I do want to allude to the idea that none of that would have been possible were it not for men. Which brings me to my next point. We have to talk about laws and divorce specifically and how that negatively impacts men. Divorce laws, particularly in Western countries, have evolved to try to address fairness and equality, but they've also contributed to significant disparities in how men and women experience divorce. And these laws have had a profound impact on marriage rates, divorce rates, and the ways in which men and women even engage in the institution of marriage. One example of how it negatively impacts men is the concept of alimony. Divorce laws often require men, specifically high-earning men, to pay spousal support or alimony to their ex-wives. And this is based on the idea that their ex-spouse or ex-wife may have sacrificed her career or earning potential in general as a consequence to being in this partnership, particularly with the assumption that there's children involved or they're maintaining the household. And while this is meant to ensure financial stability for lower income women, it can also place a heavy financial burden on men, especially if the marriage was short-lived or if the man had minimal input in any of these sacrifices. When it comes to child support, and it's not news that divorce laws tend to favor women when it comes to child custody, where mothers often receive primary care of their children. And this results in men not only losing regular access to their children, but also being expected and required to pay a significant amount of money in child support, even in cases where the father is an equally capable parent. And this leads men to feel marginalized with limited visitation rights, which can be emotionally devastating. Now, here I also want to allude to something that I suggested in the previous video around how children need fathers, young boys specifically, for rough and tumble play. But as a female who grew up without a father figure until I got into my late teens, I can tell you the impact that it had on me in not knowing how a man should lead or what a true masculine role looked like in my life until I got older. Fathers or access to children as a parental figure, particularly masculine figure, there's also a ton of research around the importance and childhood outcomes with fatherless homes versus a father being present in the home. My point being that the role that fathers play in child development and relationships down the road is critically important. And I do think that the court system, judicial system, and laws overlook these things regularly. Now, the divorce laws also look at assets, specifically property division, and this tends to be split evenly between the two partners. But there's other things outside of a home: savings, assets, retirement funds, etc. Even if the man was solely responsible for acquiring these assets, the law often requires them to split these with their ex-wives. Now, here's one really important thing that needs to be discussed, and this is the concept of false allegations, which I alluded to regarding the Me Too movement in the last video, but I want to be more clear here. Many men are vulnerable to false allegations of domestic violence and abuse. Specifically, around divorce proceedings. And in contentious divorces, these accusations can be strategically used by women to gain leverage in a custody battle or to secure financial benefits. Even unproven allegations can severely damage a man's reputation, and you guys have seen this play out. And this is where the concept of innocent until proven guilty is a really great idea, but doesn't always play out in reality. Because women are always seen as innocent, and there's value to that statement, some of them can be incredibly manipulative and calculated. And so the combination of financial obligations, alimony, child support, legal fees, and the emotional turmoil that men go through, limited access to their children, loss of property, loss of investments, retirement, etc., this can leave men in dire situations and can result in long-term financial strain, mental health issues such as depression, and feelings of being completely trapped relative to the legal system. And if we look at suicide rates over time, well, they have increased for men since the 1970s. And for those who have followed the trend in women's rights, well, this may come as no surprise. Now, I also don't want to suggest that there is never a place or time where women should not receive some type of financial support if indeed they went into the marriage under the assumption and agreement that she was going to take care of the house and the children because he was going to provide for her. That to me makes sense. But this is a conversation that spouses need to have with one another prior to going into a marriage, and I do think prenuptial agreements are necessary in certain cases. Not only does it protect a man and his assets, it protects her and their children in the future. Now, as we can see in a lot of the men's dialogue, and many of you have left comments here, that it's not worth it to get married or get into serious relationships because you guys get rode hard and put away wet. But truthfully, because of these laws and the consequences of getting into a marriage with somebody who might flip on you, the consequences seem to be way more painful than the positive potential of pursuing a long-term partnership in the first place. And the prospect of building your assets and then having them taken away from you makes the entire thing less appealing. And this is one of the reasons why many men have opted out and choose to just remain single. Now, on the other concept of divorce, we have to talk about divorce laws relative to no-fault divorce. And this has empowered women to leave marriages over time, just because they find them unfulfilling or unsatisfactory, and they don't typically face large legal consequences. And while this gives women greater autonomy, and in some cases positively impacted women's ability to leave very toxic or DV-type situations, it's also made it a lot easier and much more common, as I alluded to earlier, with women initiating over 70% of divorces. And overall, as a personal frustration in all of this, there's an overall decline in traditional marriage values. This shift away from tradition in marriage and the value and the meaning underneath it has been initiated with this ease of divorce and the idea that it's just like a dating game, like you just break up and then you do that and have this beautiful financial safety net post-divorce set up for you. And this leads into this concept that marriage is not something that you fight for, and it's not a permanent situation where you're both committed, honorable, integral, and loyal to one another. Instead, it just leaves it as anytime I'm dissatisfied with you or I find something better, I can just leave. And this is where the red pill community gets a lot of their arguments correct. They are highly aware of the disadvantages that men face when it comes to divorce. And now that we've talked about men's spaces, well, we have to talk about women's rights. As I alluded to in my last video, there are some positive things that I think came for women as a consequence to women's rights movements. But third wave feminism, in my opinion, and relative to what we see culturally, has potentially taken it a little bit too far. Men who once saw themselves as providers, protectors, who took on the hard fucking roles, who put themselves out there and sacrificed all the hard labor, are now looked at as second-class citizens because I can do it all by myself. And many men feel emasculated or uncertain about their jobs, career, and ability to excel, which leads to avoidance of relationships altogether, especially if women have become significantly more entitled. And because of hypergamy, the idea that women date up and across, the more educated that women get, well, the harder it is for them, in turn, to find a partner who is above them, especially if they're in jobs where they have a lot of financial resources and a man wants to come in and provide for her, but they make equal pay, well, it can lead to her emasculating him for all of his efforts and his achievements. And research even suggests that as this has continued to climb culturally, women are delaying marriage and children in order to focus on their careers. And this leads them to find a partner later on in life, whereas men, specifically in some of these movements, will say that a woman over 30 is, well, spoiled goods. Now, not only have these movements really empowered women in ways that I don't know are best for them, but they've also demonized traditionally masculine values, which I personally believe are incredibly important. But there is such a thing, just like there are toxic women everywhere, there are also some of you in my comment section that seem to be very toxic men. Now, I don't believe this is the majority of men, just like I don't believe the majority of women are completely toxic. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. And in some cases of these feminist movements, it's really easy to vilify men and point to them as being the root of all evil. But qualities like leadership, assertiveness, competitiveness are strengths and are incredibly necessary, not just for men and women dynamics, but for culture and society to accelerate in a positive direction at all. But now, anytime a man asserts himself, disagrees, or stands tall with his boundaries, it seems as though he's perceived as toxic. And many men feel like their natural traits are unfairly criticized, leading to a lot of confusion, frustration, and resentment with the current culture in modern society. And men are increasingly told to be more vulnerable or sensitive. But men also feel like when they do these things, well, these things aren't valued and indeed can be weaponized, especially in romantic or professional contexts. And so it feels as though men can never be the right thing. They're too hard or they're too soft. They want to be vulnerable, but when they do, they get it thrown back in their face. And over time, with enough experiences that reinforce that belief, it will solidify men avoiding any type of relationship dynamic whatsoever. Now, the other thing that's really important, reflective of feminist movements, is they always tend to beat the drum of the patriarchy. Men are portrayed as the oppressors and responsible for all of the ills of society, from workplace discrimination to sexual harassment. And if you don't know what the patriarchy is, it's presented as a male-dominated system that tends to benefit men at the expense of women. And there are plenty of campaigns that focus on the fault of men. Some messaging in feminism, DEI, all can lead to this environment where men feel they're under constant scrutiny. And this will make them more hesitant to express themselves or pursue anything as far as a leadership role or excelling in a place that would require them to assert. And I don't mean that in a dehumanizing way, as if they are dominating everybody to obliteration, but necessarily so. Men are a little bit more competitive, and I think that's a good thing. And because they can't excel, or when they do excel, then they're talked down to, or they're mansplaining, or whatever it might be, this can lead them to feel like their contributions are completely overlooked or undervalued. And on the other side of that, their failures are often overemphasized. Now, what's important to note with women's rights and feminism is that the third and the fourth wave tended to have a much more radical edge. While early feminism focused on achieving equality, later feminism has emphasized a much more radical stance. Instead of seeking equality, it seems that now we are focused on achieving female dominance and somewhat revenge for historical injustices. And this continues to foster adversarial relationships, where men are viewed as enemies rather than allies. Movements specifically that focus on smashing the patriarchy can inadvertently alienate men and will continue to foster a hostile climate where any type of cooperation between the genders feels almost impossible. And the push for women's rights and empowerment has, in some cases, created a culture where certain types of women feel almost entitled to special treatment, or they use victimhood as a form of power. And this is particularly evident in social media and public discourse, where women will utilize feminist rhetoric to avoid any type of personal accountability or demand preferential treatment, which many of you thought that I was going for in my last video, but here we are. For example, some women may interpret disagreement or criticism as misogyny or sexism, which will cause them to weaponize their gender to shut down any type of opposing viewpoints. Additionally, the focus on empowerment has led to some double standards in behavior. Certain women feel entitled to engage in certain types of behaviors that they would criticize men for engaging with themselves, i.e. aggression or manipulation. But they do these things under the guise of empowerment. And this can lead to toxic dynamics where women view themselves as inherently virtuous or above reproach, while men are continually criticized. And in romantic relationships, some women have adopted a much more adversarial approach, where they are encouraged to prioritize their own self-interest and independence over cooperation and compromise. And feminist discourse sometimes promotes the idea that men are often disposable and replaceable. And this continues to reinforce women to pursue their own goals at the expense of their relationship. And men in these dynamics often feel emasculated or devalued, as the traditional role of mutual support and partnerships in a relationship is completely undermined. Furthermore, the rise of toxic femininity, where some women use manipulation, shame, or emotional abuse to control men, is a growing concern in modern gender dynamics overall. The shift in gender dynamics, where men are often portrayed as problematic or completely unnecessary, have contributed to a growing overall gender divide in both dating, relationships, marriage, and monogamy. And as a consequence to this, many men are just opting out of the dating market altogether, contributing to the rise of single men, lower marriage rates, and an increased reliance on casual relationships. rather than any type of committed partnership. Now, listen, here's where I want to leave this at. Many of you will sit here and demonize the idea of modern women, but the truth is, most of you assholes are sitting in the basement jerking off to OnlyFans, and that would be a complete stereotype, because for many of you, that's probably not true at all. But the more that we try to put each other into these extremist boxes, as if it applies to the masses in general, the further this disconnect is gonna get. You can do what you will with this information, and if you already had your mind made up, then my goal isn't to change it. But if you are somebody who's on the fence about this topic overall, or would prefer to see things improve, you'd be hard-pressed to find something that's more fulfilling than a strong relationship with a good woman. And this isn't just coming from me and my own desires. I've already worked with hundreds of men who have the car, have the career, have the success, and the only missing piece to their life that resulted in true fulfillment was a real relationship with an honest woman who actually loved them. So that's all I got. And if this video held your attention to this point, here's a video on the 10 things that men need to know about women before they turn 40. Now, I would tell you to fuck off, but apparently that's not nice either. Bye. We can't even be playful here. We can't even be playful.